Hi, my name is Tomas Guevara, and this is the channel Rewriting the Reality. Did you know what consciousness is? It's okay, the science doesn't know what it is. Therefore, don't feel ashamed. Subscribe to this channel and you will start to remember everything. Here is the first part of the transcript of the podcast, The Joy of Why, by Stephen Strogatz. Quote, Stephen Strogatz, I'm Steve Strogatz, and this is The Joy of Why, a podcast from Quantum Magazine that takes you into some of the biggest unanswered questions in math and science today. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the mystery of consciousness. The mystery being that when your brain cells fire in certain patterns, it actually feels like something. It might feel like jealousy, or a toothache, or the memory of your mother's face, or the scent of her favorite perfume. But other patterns of brain activity don't really feel like anything at all. Right now, for instance, I'm probably forming some memories somewhere deep in my brain. But the process of that memory formation is imperceptible to me. I can't feel it. It doesn't give rise to any sort of internal subjective experience at all. In other words, I'm not conscious of it. So how does consciousness happen? How is it related to physics and biology? Are animals conscious? What about plants? Or computers, could they ever be conscious? And what is consciousness exactly? My guest today, Dr. Anil Seth, studies consciousness in his role as the co-director of the Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science at the University of Sussex, near Brighton, England. The centre brings together all sorts of disciplinary specialists, from neuroscientists to mathematicians to experts in virtual reality, to study the conscious experience. Dr. Seth is also the author of the book Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. He joins us from studios in Brighton, England. Anil, thanks for being here. Anil Seth, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. Strogatz, well, this is, I have to say, one of my favorite and most perplexing things to think about. I don't really know where to start with it. I mean, consciousness is so mysterious. I sometimes have this uncanny sensation, maybe like once or twice a year. I'll be looking in the bathroom mirror, shaving. And then I get this creepy feeling like, what is this lump of matter looking back at me in the mirror? Like, who's in there? Seth, yeah, welcome to my world. This sounds like a description of my everyday. Now, in one sense, you leave the mystery behind when you go and make dinner and leave your normal life. But it does have this habit of going everywhere with you. And most days, I'll have a moment like that. And I will try and train myself also just to continually reflect and meditate on this everyday miracle that we have this electrified pate inside our skull. And that somehow, in conjunction with the body and its interaction with the world, there isn't just complicated biological machinery chugging away, there is subjective experience. It feels like something to be me, and it feels like something to be you, to use a definition that comes from the philosopher Thomas Nagel. And that is really still quite astounding. It doesn't feel like anything to be a table or a chair. But this is the fundamental mystery of consciousness. And it's both a deep scientific and philosophical mystery, but also a very personal mystery. Because part of the feeling like is the feeling of being a particular person. Being the individual that you are. Being you or being me. Strogatz, you have just introduced the word self. You can be conscious of various things, you can also be conscious of having a self. Should we start to try to tease apart the different concepts related to consciousness? What is consciousness? How is it different from self-consciousness? Seth, I think that's a good idea. There's always this problem with definition when it comes to a poorly understood phenomenon. Looking back at the history of science, I think we both know that definitions aren't sort of written in stone and you settle on one and then you just try and figure out what the underlying science is. The definitions always evolve along with our understanding. And so for consciousness, the place I start is with this definition from philosopher Thomas Nagel, who simply said, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. It feels like something to be. Yeah, that's fairly circular. But I like it because it hits the bullseye that it's just talking about experience, and it's useful for what it leaves out. It's often tempting, and this has happened before in many other examples, of associating consciousness implicitly with something else, whether that's intelligence, or having language or behaving in a particular way. Or knowing who I am in an explicit, reflective sense of self. All of these things may be aspects of human consciousness. But consciousness in general is not the same as any of these other things. It's just the raw fact of that experiencing. But then within that, there are indeed further divisions that you can make. And I think this is heuristically useful in dividing up the problem so we can get at consciousness from a kind of divide and conquer strategy. And there are 3 ways that I like to do it. There's the level of being conscious at all. You lose it when you're under general anesthesia or in dreamless sleep. Then you are conscious of what's around you, the world. And then within that, there's the experience of being yourself, of being the person that you are. Strogatz, I thought that was a terrific aspect of your book, as far as helpfulness to me as a reader, to be able to think about chopping up the problem in various ways. You mentioned 4 levels, the level of consciousness, the issue of what you call the content or contents of consciousness, what we're conscious of or what we perceive, consciousness of self, and then the 4th one, you say, is this really profound mystery of being you? Seth, well, I actually think the 3rd and the 4th are rather the same. Strogatz, okay, fine. Seth, but there are many ways of experiencing being yourself. So, we can have experiences of self without knowing that we're having these experiences. I can experience being associated with this object that's my body, and I can have emotions and moods. And all of that can in principle unfold without attaching a name and a set of memories to it. So there are, within each of these areas of content and level and self, there are of course more fine-grained distinctions that we can make. And we can ask whether these finer-grained distinctions have any traction in the laboratory or the clinic. Do they pick out joins in nature? Or do they not? Are they things we just sort of make up? And that's part of, I think, the game of consciousness research. We can figure out which of our distinctions have traction in the real world. Strogatz, great, I do appreciate that, because on this podcast, we try to talk about science, especially big mysteries in science. But I would want to underline the word science. That there are things we can ponder that are outside the realm of science, not even testable or refutable in principle. And I take it that you really are focused on the scientific side of consciousness. I'm sure your philosophical side likes pondering the unanswerables as well. Seth, well, I don't think philosophy is just pondering the unanswerables. I think science and philosophy really work together in understanding something for which it's not clear what a satisfactory understanding would look like. Now, we don't necessarily need philosophy if we are at the stage of the Human Genome Project, where we know exactly what we're doing and it's just a sort of engineering problem of how we do it. But when it comes to consciousness, there's still a mystery not only about how it happens, but about what a successful answer would even look like. Strogatz, I appreciate your use of the word explain here because I'd like to get into the question of what you have sometimes called the real problem of consciousness as opposed to the easy problem. So, what is the real problem? Seth, so, science and philosophy really still need each other. You know, with the one, science without philosophy is a bit blind, and philosophy without science is a bit lame. So, I've never formally studied philosophy, but it's always been in my environment. And I've benefited enormously from talking to and collaborating with philosophers and even trying out some philosophy ideas myself. I think we need it. It keeps science honest, and it helps guide it to the right kinds of questions. But I think there's still approaches to consciousness which I find less appealing, which are those that are in principle non-testable, which may be purely philosophical positions. There's a position that's becoming quite popular these days called panpsychism, which is this idea that consciousness isn't something that brains generate, or that is identical to particular kinds of brain processes or biological processes, but that it's fundamental and ubiquitous. That it's somehow everywhere and in everything like charge or mass energy. This is maybe superficially an appealing idea, because if you just say consciousness is there from the get-go, then you don't have to explain how it comes about in certain places and not others. But it doesn't really explain anything. And it's not only that it's not testable, it doesn't lead to anything that could be testable. And it's that I find off-putting. I think philosophical perspectives, they're rarely themselves testable. Like materialism, the view that I sort of work with, the idea that consciousness is a natural phenomenon and is somehow a property of material things like brains and bodies. That itself is probably not testable. But what it does do is it leads to things that are testable, and over time allows us to explain things about consciousness that we would otherwise not be able to explain. The real problem is how to explain, predict, and maybe even control properties of consciousness in terms of their underlying mechanisms in the brain and the body. And that sounds like sort of an obvious thing that we should be trying to do, right? But it's actually not so much, because these properties of consciousness that I'm talking about that we should try to explain, they are primarily experiential, or what we would call phenomenological properties. Which is an incredibly long word, but what it really just means is the way in which conscious experiences appear as experiences, not what they allow us to do so much, or what functions they might have in terms of the cognitive architecture of the brain. Like, why is a visual experience the way it is and different from an emotional experience? Visual experiences, they have spatial character, they have objects, and things move. An emotional experience doesn't have these sorts of things, right? It has valence, things are good or bad. So, the real problem is about connecting mechanisms in the brain to these kinds of properties of phenomenology. The reason I called it the real problem was as a bit of a pushback, a kindly, friendly pushback against this hard/easy problem distinction from David Chalmers that has really dominated a lot of the contemporary science and philosophy of consciousness. And the reason it's different is because the hard problem of consciousness is this big, scary mystery. It's the problem that we mentioned at the start of this conversation. How is it that consciousness happens at all? What is it about matter arranged in a particular way that makes experience happen? I mean, Chalmers puts it like this himself, he said, it is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. And that's a hard problem. It's not just difficult. It's hard in this conceptual sense of nobody even really knows what a good answer would look like. And then Chalmers separate that from the easy problems. And by the easy problems, basically, these are all the problems about how brains work, for which you don't really need to bring consciousness into the picture at all. You know, how the brain transforms sensory signals into actions and making decisions and so on. And my worry with that approach was either you focus on this incredibly challenging hard problem, or you don't really focus on consciousness at all. And I think there's a middle ground, which is very productive, which is in fact what a lot of people are already doing, which is, yes, you accept consciousness exists, and that it's intimately related to the brain and the body, and you just try to explain its properties. And the hope is that as you do this, then the apparent mystery of the hard problem will bit by bit begin to lessen. And you won't necessarily solve the hard problem this way, but you might dissolve it, so that it eventually disappears into a puff of metaphysical smoke. And we realize that even though we haven't started out to solve this big question, we've actually got a very good naturalistic explanation that tells us so many things about consciousness in terms of their underlying mechanisms. And that's all that a scientific explanation in the end is supposed to do. Strogatz, if we could give a concrete example of these distinctions, I think it might help. So, you mentioned earlier the visual experiences that we have. For instance, if I see something that's red, you might naively say, well, I understand that that's going to be different from smelling something that smells like a flower. Because, okay, being super naive, but with a little biology background, in the case of visual, my visual cortex is lighting up. You know, the neurons in a particular part of my brain are active, whereas in the case of a smell, it's something in the olfactory part of my brain. So, is that sort of the easy style of explanation, but not the hard? Seth, it's almost a different thing again, I'm afraid. It's more the pragmatics, which is a good starting point. But a lot of empirical work in this area got going by just looking for correlations. So, you might find that whenever you have a visual experience, indeed that certain neurons in your visual cortex light up in a particular way. And when you're smelling a rose, neurons in your olfactory cortex light up in a particular way. And of course, you can then establish correlations between things happening in your experience and things happening in your brain. But correlations, the mere existence of correlations between things, don't really tell you how and why those correlations are obtained. Correlations are just not explanations, as we all know from statistics and physics. I mean, there are all these wonderful examples of weird correlations, like the divorce rate in Paris correlating with the price of cheese in Wisconsin or something like that. Right, whatever it is. There are things that correlate for which it's just arbitrary and sometimes a statistical artifact. The challenge is to go beyond correlation, to show why is it that these neurons are behaving in this particular way. Why does that give us the particular properties that characterize a visual experience, that it's extended in space, that there's color, that there are objects, as distinct from an emotional experience? That's what I'm getting at. This is the bit that's not easy. I mean, this really is a challenge. It's not the hard problem. But it's certainly an extremely challenging problem. But I think it's something that neuroscience, boosted by computational modeling and a bit of maths and physics, it's an approach where we can get a grip and we can make progress. Well, I'll give you an example. For instance, in vision, I have a mug of tea in front of me. If I hold it up in front of me, my experience of this mug is that it's a three-dimensional object, that it has a back, even though the back is not directly visible to my eyes. You know, there's something object about it. And that's an interesting phenomenological property. It doesn't apply to everything. If you stare up at a featureless blue sky, it doesn't seem like an object. If you stare at the sun and then look away, there's an afterimage, which doesn't feel like an object. And emotions don't feel like objects. So, it's an interesting property of visual experience. How might we explain how that happens? Well, that's where the fun starts. And then you can start constructing theories about how brain mechanisms generate perceptions, and how those brain mechanisms might, arranged in a particular way, account for this property of objectness that characterizes our visual experience. In this case, the idea that I was writing about quite a while ago now is that we perceive the back of the mug even though we don't directly see it because the brain is making predictions about the sensory information it would get if we were to rotate the mug. It kind of knows what philosophers Alva Noe and Kevin Oregon called the sensory-motor contingencies. The brain knows what would happen if I rotate the mug in a particular way. And the thought is, it's that baked-in knowledge that we're not aware that our brain has about how sensory signals respond to actions, that can explain the objectness of certain kinds of visual experience. That's the idea. And then, of course, you've got to try and test it, which is really hard. Strogatz, well, this part is so much fun to think about and also feels very deep, scientifically, and sort of shocking. So, I'm thinking of so many examples from magic, from optical illusions, from psychology experiments. The phrase that you use in the book, controlled hallucinations, it feels like this is the territory you're encroaching on now. Seth, that's exactly right. Yeah. And it's interesting. It's not a phrase that I came up with. I heard about it from one of my senior mentors, really, Chris Frith, and he heard about it from somewhere else, etc., etc. But it's got a bit of a sticking power. No metaphor is perfect, but this helps us get a handle. So, the idea behind the concept of controlled hallucination is that our experiences of the world and indeed of the self, they're not direct readouts of what's actually there, even though it may seem that way in our experience. You open your eyes in the morning, and there's just a world. And it seems as though the world is just pouring itself into your mind through the transparent windows of your eyes and your other senses. But this is not what is going on. And of course, this has been recognized, certainly in philosophy, since Plato, and then Kant and then science forever as well. That perception, what we experience, is an active interpretation of the sensory information that comes in. And this sensory information, it doesn't come with labels on, like, I'm from a cat or a coffee cup, or I'm red or green, or I'm from the back of a mug, or even I'm from the heart or the stomach. From the brain's perspective, it's electrical impulses. It's just activity. So, the idea is that the brain is always trying to figure out the most likely cause of the sensory information that it gets. It can't directly know what the world is like. I mean, who knows what the world is really like? That's really a question for a physicist. It's certainly not something that is reflected directly in our experience. And the brain is always then trying to make its best guess about the causes of the sensory signals that it gets. How does it do that? Well, here comes the modern gloss on this. It's a theory called predictive processing or predictive coding, or active inference in another recent guise. And the idea is quite simple. It's that the brain is always generating predictions about the way the world is or the way the body is. And it uses the sensory signals to just calibrate these predictions to keep them tied to the world, in ways that are not necessarily titrated by accuracy, but by their utility for the organism. So, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. But there's a really provocative flip here, which is to realize, or at least this is the hypothesis, that what we perceive is not just sort of modulated by the brain's expectations, but it's built from them. So that the world we experience really does come from the inside out, rather than from the outside in. And the sensory signals, they're just reporting what we call prediction errors, the difference between what the brain is expecting and what it's getting at every level of processing. So, when I experience this mug that I'm holding in front of me, the perceptual content, the mugness of that mug, that is not a readout of light waves coming into the eyes. It's the brain's best guess of what's going on that is calibrated by the light waves that come into the retina, and so on. So, this is why I use the word controlled hallucination, because it shares with the common understanding of hallucination that it's an experience that comes from within. But the control is equally important. I'm certainly not saying that our experience is arbitrary, or that the real world doesn't exist or anything like that. No, the world exists. But our experience of it is always a construction, always an act of interpretation. And it is controlled by sensory signals coming from the world. And evolution has made damn sure of that our perceptual experiences work in service of our behavior. And of course, they can go wrong. And that's when we get fun illusions, and why magic tricks work and all this wonderful stuff. But what we see, and that, for me, is just a wonderful thing to reflect on. And it goes right back to very basic things like color. I mean, color is not a independent property of the world. Even though it might seem that way. Our brains create color from mixtures of colorless electromagnetic radiation. And in the case of color, I think it's really a powerful example. Because in a sense, what we experience is less than what's there. Because we only detect a tiny slice of the energy in the electromagnetic spectrum, a very thin slice of reality, 3 wavelengths, more or less, for most of us. But out of those 3 wavelengths, we generate an almost infinite palette of rich colors. So, what we experience in color is both less than and more than what's really there. And I think the same sort of weird mapping holds in all other aspects of our experience too. It's not just a filter of what's there. It's a construction that uses sensory signals to build this experience, this subjective experience of a world with all sorts of properties that help us behave. But these properties, they exist. Where do they exist? They're in the continuing interaction between the brain, the body, and the world. They're not just out there in the world, or just in the brain. Unquote. This is only a partial transcript of the podcast. But it's enough to explain how mistaken Steve Strogatz and Anil Seth are. But not only them, but the entire science community. In my episodes 5 and 6, I explained how we create our reality. Now, let's explain that no matter how hard you try to create something using your brain, you will never create anything but a headache. No matter how much you concentrate on, you will never create what you want, but what you don't want. Seth mentioned panpsychism theory to explain consciousness, and this one is the more accurate until now. Because the brain doesn't generate consciousness. However, the brain is conscious of being an organ. But our beliefs are making this organ to work in a deficient way. There is not a place that consciousness doesn't come in. Consciousness is everything. The real problem is not how to explain or predict or control the properties of consciousness, but to accept that we created everything using our perceptions mechanism. The brain doesn't generate perceptions. It doesn't generate sensory signal into actions either. That is done by the objective-subjective self by given instructions to the brain at speeds faster than the speed of light. When our senses give information to the brain processes it according to our beliefs, then it generates analysis of what our senses input to it. After that you react to what the brain tells you it is in from a view. In some situation you act following only your intuition, and your intuition is the subjective self, contacting your objective self. We are always controlling and predicting the properties of consciousness, but we are not paying attention. Proving it is very easy to do. We can use hypnosis to prove it. Regarding the mugness of the mug, let's say that you travel to the past and encounter an early human being near a pond. To gain his trust you offer him a gift, a colorful mug. He will never use the mug to drink water, unless you show him how to do it. Now, Because we invented the mug, we will use it to drink, no matter what color or form it has. All this knowledge about the mug is stored in a regional area of the consciousness for our use. That is why Marconi and Tesla have the same idea about the radio almost at the same time. Both reach to this area of the consciousness known as regional area 2. The area of our dreams. And by the way, we are never in a dreamless sleep. We are always dreaming. We need to understand that we are one, meaning that we all are connected. That is why you are never unconscious, not even under anesthesia or in dreamless sleep. First, your subjective self is always conscious, and it works in perfect harmony with the objective self. That is why under hypnosis you can remember everything. Unless you are afraid of your memories and your objective self refuse to bring the memories back, and therefore, the doctor needs to use another approach to recover these memories. According to Seth, Chalmers asked himself, why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? The answer is very simple, to give us the purity of experience. That is why we created this reality. And billions of other realities that we are going to start experiencing in another 30 to 50 years. That is why we invented the James Webb Telescope. In a few days, I am going to record the second part of this video. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to this channel.